So today's Thinking Thursday is going to have some strange lighting because I actually finished work at midnight, and so it's like 1 in the morning now that I'm finally getting to do this. And my nose is gradually healing, which is great. But yes, next week it should be better lighting. Perhaps this will be fully healed. But anyway, today we're going to talk about Floyd Dell, who was a real advocate for men being feminists. And we'll talk a bit more about his specific position towards men being feminists and why they should be feminists a bit later, but I'll first give you a bit of context about him. He was born on the 28th of June, 1887 in Barry in Illinois in the United States, and he was the son of Anthony Dell, who was a Civil War veteran. It's crazy that it really wasn't that long ago, but yeah, his dad was a Civil War veteran and then a failed butcher, and his mum had been a school teacher but then gave up teaching when she became a mum, and he grew up pretty much in poverty. They had to move a lot, so even though he was born in Barry, they ended up moving to Quincy in Illinois, and he spent a lot of his childhood there, and he kind of fell in love with the Quincy library, and his mum was super encouraging towards his reading, so books were kind of an escape for him. And then in 1903 they moved to Davenport in Iowa, and Davenport was like a really cosmopolitan place. It was really liberal, and it actually had a lot of like intellectualism going on. And he actually left high school in the Davenport High School to become a reporter. So after the summer of 1904, he just didn't go back to school, and he became a reporter for a local magazine and for local newspapers. And then it kind of built from there, and he started doing more and more publications, started to publish his poems first in like small local publications and then bigger and then national. And then he became part of the founders of the Davenport group. Now, these were kind of radical writers in Davenport who were socialists mostly. Socialism is kind of the movement of that things should be in social possession rather than in private possession. So like schools should be owned by the society and hospitals should be owned by the society and not by a single private owner. But there's loads of different kind of determinations of socialism and sectors of socialism and concepts of socialism. So from one socialist to the next, they might disagree on a lot of things, but this group was connected through socialism, but also even more so connected through modernism. And so they followed the principle that they were going to work in the literary arts, but they were going to try and make something new of it. So Ezra Pound, who was a famous writer, had said, make it new. So he was saying, take the form and turn it on its head, take narrative and switch it up, like really just make literature brand new from what it had been and break all the conventions of literature that had come before. And so this group, the Davenport group, were all about really switching up the writing that they were doing in comparison to what had come previously. And they had some really big names in the group. So I'll read the list that was the original group. So you have Susan Glaspell, who in 1931 actually got a Pulitzer Prize for Alison's House. And then her husband, George Cram Cook, and George's daughter, Nyla Cram Cook. Susan and George were actually the founders of the Provincetown Players, the like theatre company. And then you also had Arthur Davison Ficke, Alice French, who was like super famous, like big national star of literature, Charles Eugene Banks, and Harry Hansen. So these are some really big names, and they were being very kind of like new and convention breaking with their writing and their modernism. But Floyd was really involved in the socialist writing that they were doing, because what they were doing is they were capturing what life was like in that kind of intellectual cosmopolitan time in Davenport. And so it's half seen as like amazing literature, but it's half seen as kind of great history, because they were writing about social issues as well as the social life that was going on in Davenport. And it was really interesting to hear it from their voices, especially Floyd Dell. Floyd Dell has this incredible kind of satirical interesting, quirky, tongue-in-cheek way of writing. And so it's just super enjoyable to read his perspective of what was going on at the time. In 1908, he actually managed to become a full-time writer, thankfully, and he met this really interesting character who was of huge influence to him. So the Davenport Library had a director who was a very independent woman called Marilla Waite Freeman. And she was this super independent older woman who ran the library, but was super passionate about books, about the interests of history, about all these different subjects. She was extremely well read and super intelligent. And she was so influential upon Floyd that he wrote a book called Mooncalf, which was kind of semi-autobiographical, where he kind of wrote himself in as this character called Felix, who's from like an impoverished background, is like super into books, and he sort of like struggles with really intense relationships and romances and financial difficulties. And then he meets this amazing intellectual woman in the book called Helen Raymond. But Helen Raymond is inspired by Marilla. And Helen has all the intellectualism, the passion. She's this like self-determining, independent woman. And she really stands for female empowerment. She's this incredibly passionate, productive woman. And it was Floyd's way of writing a character and showing the world that women weren't just to be receivers of social change, but they were proponents of social change, that they were the ones who were creating intellectualism right alongside him, as they had been in the Davenport group, right? He was working with female writers who were really part of pushing the social movement forward and emancipating themselves. He said of Marilla Waite Freeman that she gave him a glimpse of the mountaintops by showing him all the different subjects in her library and all the amazing wonders of the world that had been captured through literature. In 1908, he moved to Chicago and started writing for the Friday Literary Review, which was like nationally published. It wasn't just a Chicago thing. And it was like really well read, had a lot of readership. And so he was kind of promoting a lot of writers through that. But then in 1913, he moved to New York City, where he wrote an incredible essay called Women as World Builders, which is this fantastic feminist essay all about how women are not just receivers of social change, but proponents of social change and producers of social change, and how they not only can emancipate others, but emancipate themselves, and they can empower themselves and enrich themselves. It's an incredible read, but it's also a really great read because it's from him. He's such an interesting writer. It's an essay, and it is like an essay on the social atmosphere of the time, but it's just written in a really entertaining way. And then he also became a co-editor and writer for Max Eastman's The Masses, which was a magazine that was all about social change, socialism, talking about the social issues of the time. But at the time, he was working so much. And his housemate really summed this up. His housemate was the poet Oric Johns. And Oric said, he was working like a dock laborer. I think he must have spent 20 hours a day writing, for his typewriter could always be heard. And that's the interesting thing of like, yes, Floyd did actually manage to become a full-time writer, but he was having to work so much just to make enough money to get by. And he couldn't live independently. He had to have a housemate, which was nice, I suppose. Like, you know, if he was a big socialite, and he was known for being very flamboyant, so maybe he did love it. But by that point, I think maybe he would have wanted to have a bit more financial freedom. Then the weirdest thing happened. In 1917, the Espionage Act of 1917 was passed. And this was to stop anything that might interfere with military operations or to promote any narrative that might be the enemy to the United States. This was during wartime, but it basically gave the government an excuse to just shut anyone or any publications down that it didn't like. And The Masses was really not what the government liked. So The Masses, Max Eastman's magazine, was shut down, and the entire staff was charged with unlawfully and willfully obstructing the recruiting and enlistment of the United States military. Okay, from some bad press, I don't know, but the fine that went with this was $10,000. In 1917, actually, I think when they were being charged, it was 1918, but $10,000 was a huge amount of money, and it came with a 20-year sentence. 20 years of time and a $10,000 fine for writing an article that was against enlistment. So the entire magazine staff is being charged. However, the thing that happened in the courts is even more insane than the charge that they were up against. So the jury couldn't come to a unanimous conclusion because there was one socialist who was saying, no, they shouldn't be charged. And that one socialist was then ganged up on by the rest of the jury, who tried to get the prosecutor to prosecute that one socialist juror, and then the rest of the jury dragged that one juror out into the street and tried to lynch him. This actually led to the judge calling a mistrial, so then the staff were let go and they didn't have to pay the fine, but it meant that the masses were shut down. And then they just started a new publication, which was called The Liberator, which is quite funny if you think about it. So then Floyd Dell became the co-editor of The Liberator from 1918. In 1919, he published an essay called Were You Ever a Child?, which is a criticism of the conventional teaching of children and childhood education system, where he's basically saying that there's such an arbitrariness in how children are taught, and that there's this like crazy experience of just a bell going off every hour and then switching tasks all the time. He gives this idea of a man who is like painting, and then suddenly a bell goes off, and like mid brushstroke he suddenly starts reading a poem aloud, and then another bell goes off and he's chiseling marble, and then he's also playing the flute and telling children to stand up straight. And this is the educational experience that the children are having, and it means that they can't really get to grips with any subject because they don't have proper time with it, but they also can't find themselves in it. They can't develop passion for any one subject because they're just kind of getting this fast slipstream of different subjects. And so this is where Floyd is really using critique to show how this is just a bizarre experience that isn't going to teach a child any kind of depth with any skills, but it's also not going to teach them how to be passionate about any specific skill. Floyd is quite sharp with how he describes teachers, and he says that teachers are hired by default because they aren't specifically trained in any one thing, so they can't teach any child how to be passionate and truly professional in any one skill. So I would say that it's one of his essays that I agree with less. But I still love the way that it's written, and I love the thing that he starts it with. So literally the like foreword or the dedication at the beginning of it is, to school teachers of my childhood in token of forgiveness. I just love his like satire in the way that he does these things. Mostly the reason I would recommend him is just because he's so enjoyable to read. Honestly, the way that he writes is just so entertaining. But he really does deal with social problems and social issues, and goes hardcore into research. Like, for example, he has Feminism for Men, or The Senses Triumph, or Enter the Woman, Mona Lisa and the Wheelbarrow, which are all about how he looks into the development of social change at the time that he's living in. But there is like moments I just really enjoy, like one of the things where he's talking about women being emancipated and wearing trousers. If Paul Poiret has anything to do with it, they'll be much more stylish than men's trousers. And like, I'm a huge Paul Poiret fan. Like, I love his clothes. And you know what? Floyd was absolutely right. Women's trousers are just a lot sassier, and like the slacks of the time for women were chef's kiss. Like, they were real stylish. So he was on point. But the fact that he like stops this essay just to make this point that's just like so cute and so funny, I really enjoy. Like, his writing is amazing, and you'll really enjoy reading his essays. I would highly recommend Feminism for Men, because in Feminism for Men, literally the first line is like, men will be free when women are free. And the point of the essay is really about the fact that if women have freedom and they can financially emancipate themselves, then men become financially emancipated from looking after those women. So then the duty of looking after, you know, elder members of the family, but also the children, the younger generations, can be split. And then it gives men more freedom to, you know, maybe take a holiday, do what they want to do. And so it's a really interesting essay looking at feminism from the perspective of how it benefits men. And I think this is really important because you have to remember that this publication, Feminism for Men, was written in 1914. And we often look back at that time and think, oh, you know, there was no feminism at the time. Like, even to the 50s, we think that it was like, you know, segregated by gender. And it's also talking about how men can explore gender in more open ways. But it was written in 1914. We look back at that time and we think, oh, there wasn't any kind of gender equality at all. When actually there was. It was in small groups and a lot of literary groups, but it was there. And I think it's so funny that today we still prioritize thinking about how feminism can benefit women, and we forget how much it can benefit men. It's such an enjoyable read. Like, honestly, just go and read it. I love his writing so much, but also reflect on the fact that if women are freed, men are freed in the process. And we need to encourage that notion even today, because mostly we just think about feminism as being something that's useful to women, when actually it benefits everyone. It emancipates everyone. It gives everyone more independence and more freedom because the burden of responsibility is shared. And then it takes away a lot of the restrictions that all genders are experiencing. Other reads that I would recommend is Love in the Machine Age from 1930. And also he had like an autobiography, which is called Homecoming, which I really enjoyed. And The Senses Triumph I really, really liked. But he did a load of novels as well. So there was Mooncalf, but then he kept writing all the way until 1934. And his last like novel was The Golden Spike. But his writing is just so enjoyable. And like his books like The Unmarried Father and Love Without Money really explore the edges of society, so away from that norm, away from the box of how we think that society works. It's just such an enjoyable read. And if you're really into, like I am, the Greenwich Village era, in 1926 he wrote Love in Greenwich Village. So just go treat yourself to that. But one more fascinating thing about him is that he dated Edna St. Vincent Millay for a while. Now, Edna St. Vincent Millay, I may have to do a video about because she was amazing. She was a very beautiful, amazing bisexual writer. She was like an award-winning writer, but she just had such fascinating views. She and Floyd were together from 1917 to 1918. They had this like on-off affair. I think Edna might be called polyamorous nowadays. I don't really know how Floyd would have defined himself in those terms, but I will give him like down credit for the fact that he did say that he felt like it was his responsibility to rescue Edna from her queerness, which tragic. I'm so glad that they were only together for a year, and even then it was like on off. But Edna is amazing. I may have to do a video about her, but yeah, just look her up. She's just, oh my gosh, she's amazing. But yeah, they got to date for a while. They were kind of in the same group of literary figures because both of them were like literary big heads. I wonder if Edna inspired his writing in any way, because Mooncalf came out in 1920 and I reckon he would have been writing it when he was with Edna. Or at least my experience of writing is it takes 2 damn years to make a book. So I imagine that's the case. Maybe we can give her some of the credit for the fact that it sold so well. It sold 38,500 copies and went through 11 printings. It was like a really well sold book. And that was like the beginning of his like novel series. And he went on to write novels for the rest of his life. He did actually become a little bit more conventional, and he started working for the WPA and the US Information Service in 1935, and then he retired after the Second World War. And he had a marriage to Beatrice Marie, who he had 2 sons with, and then they got divorced, and then he married Kate Kane, and they had a daughter called Mia. He died in Maryland near Washington on July 23rd, 1969. And since then, in 2015, he's become part of the Chicago Literary Hall of Fame. But what I really want to focus on is the fact that he was a man who was very much pushing the narrative that feminist movements benefit men and feminism benefits everyone. But he was also featuring female characters who were real matriarchs, but also super independent figures. They're really profound role models for women at the time, at a time that we look back on and think it was all patriarchy. There was no influences at all about emancipating women other than a few like hyper feminist women who were suffragettes, and that was it. Actually, no, there was a lot of men who were pushing the feminist movement for their own sakes. They understood that feminism benefited everyone. And I think it's really important to go all the way back to the original woman who probably influenced him in this regard and gave him the intellectual freedom that led him through his career, but also his social circles for the rest of his life. And that's his mum. So wherever Kate Crone's energies are now, Floyd Dell's mum, thank you so much for inspiring your son to become first an avid reader and then a lover of libraries and then a literary figure, because he has brought so much joy, inspiration and wisdom into the world. So Kate Crone, thank you for the influence you had on your amazing son, Floyd Dell.